I was never really close to my family. Growing up in a small town surrounded by stifling expectations, there was always one person who stood out. Ethan. We called him Uncle, even though he wasn't really part of the family. He was my dad's close friend from his younger days, someone who came into our lives like an older brother and never left. To me, he was fascinating, mysterious, confident, and unlike anyone I'd ever known. When I got his unexpected message inviting me on a trip to the mountains, I was surprised. It had been years since he and my dad had spoken, but somehow, Ethan always found time to check in on me or show up during pivotal moments. He said he cared about me, that he wanted me to experience more in life, and I believed him. That morning, with my backpack slung over my shoulder and my heart pounding, I climbed into Ethan's truck. He looked even more laid back and self-assured than I remembered. He wore a worn leather jacket, and his smile was so warm it made the cold morning feel like spring. "Ready for an adventure?" he asked, his voice a mix of teasing and sincerity. The drive to the mountains was filled with light-hearted chatter and occasional laughter. Ethan had a way of making everything sound interesting, from his stories about traveling the world to his thoughtful reflections on life. But there was something he wasn't saying. I could feel it. Every time I asked about the reason for the trip, he dodged the question, simply saying, "It's good for us to reconnect, away from everything." We arrived at the cabin by sunset, and my first thought was how small it was for two people. There was just one big bed, a cozy fireplace, and a breathtaking view of the mountains. "Hope you don't mind sharing the space," Ethan said with a chuckle as he unloaded our bags. That first night, as we settled in, I couldn't shake the tension in the air. Ethan seemed relaxed, but there was something in his eyes that unsettled me, like he was testing the waters of something I didn't yet understand. I lay beside him, trying not to think about how close we were. It was just Ethan, my uncle. Or at least, that's what I always told myself. But in that moment, I started to wonder if he might be something more. The cabin was nothing like I imagined. Tucked away deep in the woods, it was small and unassuming, with weathered wood and a sloping roof that almost disappeared into the landscape. There was no one around for miles. Not another cabin, not a car, not even a single trail sign. It was just us, the mountains, and the whisper of the wind through the trees. The kind of isolation that could either calm you or unnerve you. For me, it was a little of both. Ethan parked the truck and gestured toward the cabin with a grin. "Welcome to paradise," he said, his voice carrying a hint of pride. I stepped out, my boots crunching against the gravel, and took in the serene yet isolating surroundings. I had never been this far from civilization before, and while the fresh air felt invigorating, the sheer quietness pressed on me like a weight. "No neighbors for miles," Ethan added. "You can breathe out here." Inside, the cabin was even smaller than it looked from the outside. The single room was divided into a kitchen area, a living space with a couch, and a large bed tucked into the corner near a window overlooking the forest. There was no Wi-Fi, no television, and barely any cell service. Ethan set down his bags and stretched, his leather jacket pulling taut over his shoulders. "It's simple, but it's all we need," he said casually, as if this was perfectly normal. I nodded, trying to hide my discomfort at how close we'd be living for the next few days. My eyes drifted to the bed, wide, inviting, and clearly meant for one person. "Just one bed?" I asked. trying to sound nonchalant, though my heart gave a nervous flutter. Ethan shrugged and laughed. We're both adults. I don't snore, if that's what you're worried about. His easy confidence made me feel silly for even questioning it, but it didn't erase the unease building in my chest. There was something about him, something magnetic, almost hypnotic. We spent the evening settling in. Ethan took charge of starting a fire in the small stone fireplace while I unpacked, trying to make the space feel less cramped. Outside, the night had fallen completely, blanketing the mountains in a deep, quiet darkness. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. As we sat on the couch, Ethan poured us both a glass of whiskey from a bottle he had packed. "Nothing like this to warm you up," he said with a wink, handing me the glass. The amber liquid burned my throat, but it did make the cabin feel cozier. He started asking about my life in a way no one else ever had. Not just the surface level questions like how work or school was going, but deeper ones. What made me happy? What did I feel was missing? His blue-gray eyes locked on mine, and I found myself opening up in ways I didn't expect. I told him about my struggles, my insecurities, and how lost I sometimes felt. Ethan listened intently, his gaze unwavering, as if I was the only person in the world. "You're too young to feel like the world's closing in on you?" he said, his voice soft yet firm. "You've got so much ahead of you, Logan. Don't let anyone, not even yourself, hold you back." His words hit me harder than I wanted to admit. When it was finally time to sleep, I hesitated by the bed. Ethan had already climbed in, propped up against the pillows with a book in his hands. He looked up and smirked. "Relax. It's just a bed. I won't bite." His playful tone put me at ease, but there was an edge to it, like he was challenging me, daring me to let my guard down. I slid under the covers, trying to keep as much distance as possible between us. The bed felt impossibly small. The warmth of his body radiated through the sheets, and I couldn't ignore how close we were. My heart pounded as I lay there, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, feeling a tension I couldn't explain. At one point, Ethan shifted closer. "You okay?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. His hand brushed against mine, just for a moment, but it was enough to send a jolt through me. "Yeah," I replied, my voice barely steady. "Just not used to this kind of quiet." He chuckled softly. "You'll get used to it. Out here, you have no choice but to face what's in your head." His words lingered long after he turned off the light. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and I wondered if it was just the unfamiliarity of the cabin or something more. The second day in the cabin began quietly. The morning mist clung to the trees like a veil, making the forest seem almost otherworldly. Ethan was already up by the time I stirred, standing by the window with a mug of coffee in hand. The sight of him silhouetted against the glass was oddly captivating. He seemed so at ease, as though this secluded world was where he truly belonged. "Sleep okay?" he asked without turning around, his voice smooth and calm. I mumbled a reply, unsure how to admit that I'd hardly slept at all. Sharing a bed with him had been far more unsettling than I'd expected. Not because I didn't trust him. It was something deeper, something I couldn't quite name. The day passed in a blur of activities. Ethan showed me around the forest trails, pointing out hidden streams and secret clearings. He moved with an ease and confidence that I envied, his laughter echoing through the trees as he teased me for struggling to keep up. It was hard not to admire him. He seemed so sure of himself, so unbothered by the worries that plagued me. But as the sun dipped below the horizon and the cabin filled with the warm glow of the firelight, the air between us grew heavier. There was a kind of tension I couldn't shake, a feeling that something unspoken lingered just beneath the surface. Ethan poured us each another glass of whiskey and settled into the couch, his posture relaxed yet somehow commanding. "Logan," he began, his tone quieter now, more serious. "There's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." My heart quickened. I set my glass down, unsure of where this was going. He stared into the fire for a long moment before speaking again. "You know, your dad and I, we were close, really close." His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I nodded slowly, not trusting myself to speak. Ethan had always been a bit of a mystery to me, his connection to my family shrouded in layers I'd never fully understood. "We had a falling out," he continued, his voice tinged with regret. "I'm not sure he ever forgave me for certain things." He paused, his gaze finally meeting mine. "But I've always cared about you, Logan. Always." The way he said it made my chest tighten. There was a warmth in his eyes that felt both comforting and overwhelming. I wanted to ask what he meant, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I picked up my glass and took a long sip, hoping the whiskey would steady my nerves. As the fire crackled between us, Ethan began to share pieces of his past, things I'd never known. He spoke of love and loss, of mistakes that had shaped him in ways he couldn't undo. His openness was disarming, and I found myself drawn to him in a way I hadn't anticipated. "You're lucky, you know," he said after a while, his voice softer now. "You've got time to figure things out, to decide who you want to be." His words felt like a challenge, a push to confront the doubts I'd been avoiding. That night, as we climbed into bed again, the tension was palpable. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, acutely aware of every small movement Ethan made. At one point, he turned to face me, his breath warm against my shoulder. "You okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," I replied, though my voice betrayed my uncertainty. Ethan reached out, his hand brushing lightly against my arm. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a shiver down my spine. Neither of us said anything after that, the silence thick and loaded with everything we weren't saying. I closed my eyes, willing sleep to come, but my mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What was this feeling that gnawed at me, this pull toward him that I couldn't understand? And more importantly, did he feel it too? By the third day, the cabin no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a crucible, a place where the silence was too loud, and every glance between Ethan and me carried a weight I couldn't ignore. The weather, which had been calm and crisp, took a sudden turn. Heavy clouds rolled in, casting a gray shadow over the forest. Ethan had warned about the unpredictability of mountain storms, but I hadn't expected the thunder to rattle the very walls of the cabin. We spent most of the day indoors, confined to the small space. Ethan kept busy chopping firewood and fixing minor things around the cabin, but I could tell he was restless. His usual easy demeanor seemed strained, his movements sharper, more deliberate. I, too, felt the tension building, like the storm outside was a reflection of what was brewing between us. By the afternoon, the rain was coming down in sheets, pounding against the windows. Ethan lit the fire, and we sat on the couch, the crackling flames the only sound breaking the quiet. "Not the best weather for exploring, huh?" he said with a small smile, handing me a mug of coffee. His fingers brushed mine briefly, and the contact sent a spark through me. I nodded, forcing a laugh. Guess we're stuck here. Ethan leaned back, his gaze fixed on the fire. You ever think about what you'd do if you could just start over? His voice was calm, but there was a vulnerability in it that caught me off guard. If you could leave everything behind, no expectations, no rules, what kind of life would you want? I stared at him, unsure how to respond. No one had ever asked me that before. And the truth was, I didn't know. I'd spent so much of my life trying to fit into molds that weren't made for me. I'd never considered what I really wanted. I don't know, I admitted finally. I guess I'd want to feel free. Ethan's eyes met mine, and for a moment the air between us felt electric. Freedom's not as easy as it sounds, he said quietly. Sometimes the things we want most are the hardest to take. The thunder outside boomed, startling me. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the intensity of the moment. Ethan smiled faintly, but his expression remained serious. You've got a good heart, Logan, he said, his voice soft. Don't let the world take that from you. The rest of the evening passed in a strange, charged silence. We ate dinner by the fire, the storm continuing to rage outside. The cabin felt smaller than ever, the space between us shrinking with every passing moment. By the time we climbed into bed, I was a bundle of nerves. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, Ethan's voice broke the quiet. Logan, he began, his tone hesitant. There's something I need to tell you. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. What is it? He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. You know you can trust me, right? No matter what. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I believed it. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've been carrying a lot of guilt for a long time, he said slowly. About your dad. About why we stopped talking. My breath caught in my throat. This was the first time he'd spoken so openly about their falling out. What happened? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. It's complicated, he said, but a lot of it had to do with you. With me? I repeated, confused. He nodded, his gaze dropping to the blanket between us. I cared about you, Logan. Maybe more than I should have, and your dad. He didn't like that. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I stared at him, trying to make sense of what he was saying. Ethan? I began, but I didn't know how to finish the sentence. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a living thing. And in that moment, I realized that whatever was happening between us, it wasn't something I could ignore anymore. The storm didn't let up. By the next morning, the rain continued to pound against the windows, and the forest was shrouded in a fog so thick it felt like the world had shrunk to just this cabin. Ethan was already awake, sitting by the window with a cup of coffee. He didn't look at me when I got up, but the tension from the night before was still palpable. Coffee's on the counter, he said, his voice distant. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him, the silence between us deafening. I wanted to ask about what he'd said, about his cryptic comments regarding my dad and his feelings toward me, but I didn't know how to start. Finally, Ethan spoke. I owe you an explanation, he said, his gaze still fixed on the foggy forest, about what I said last night. I swallowed hard, setting my coffee down. Yeah, I said softly. You do. He sighed, leaning back in his chair. Your dad and I, we were close. closer than I think you ever realized. And for a while, it was great. We were like brothers. But things changed when you were born. I frowned, trying to piece together what he was saying. Why would that change anything? Ethan hesitated, running a hand through his hair. Because I saw you, Logan. And I knew I cared about you in a way that went beyond being your dad's friend. You were just a kid, and I knew it wasn't right, but as you grew up, those feelings didn't go away. His words hit me like a freight train. I stared at him, my chest tightening. Ethan, what are you saying? My voice was barely steady. I'm saying that I've always cared about you, Logan, he said, his voice low. More than I should have. And your dad, he saw it. He didn't understand, and he didn't want me around you because of it. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced as I tried to process what he was telling me. So, that's why you stopped coming around? I asked, my voice trembling. Ethan nodded. He gave me an ultimatum. Stay away from you or lose him as a friend. And I chose to leave because I knew if I stayed, I wouldn't be able to hide how I felt. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. My heart was pounding, my thoughts a chaotic mess. This is insane, I muttered, pacing the room. You're telling me what? You've been in love with me all this time? Ethan stood as well, his expression pained. I didn't mean for it to happen, Logan. And I never acted on it because I knew it wasn't fair to you. But now you're an adult, and I don't know how to pretend anymore. The weight of his words settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I turned away from him, my hands gripping the back of the chair. You should have told me, I said, my voice barely audible. You should have said something instead of keeping this bottled up. And what would I have said? Ethan shot back, his tone sharp. That I had feelings for my best friend's son. That I wanted something I could never have. Do you know how that would have sounded? His words stung, but I couldn't deny the truth in them. I turned back to face him, my eyes meeting his. There was pain there, but also something else, something I couldn't quite name. Ethan, I don't know what to do with this, I said honestly. You don't have to do anything, he replied, his voice softening. I just needed you to know. I've carried this secret for so long and I couldn't keep it from you anymore. The storm outside seemed to echo the turmoil inside me. I wanted to be angry, to push him away, but a part of me couldn't. A part of me didn't want to, and that scared me more than anything else. The storm persisted, as if the universe itself was amplifying the chaos inside me. The cabin felt impossibly small now, every corner steeped in tension. Ethan had retreated to the couch after our heated exchange, and I stayed by the window, staring out at the rain-drenched forest. My mind raced with his words, turning them over like puzzle pieces that refused to fit. I wanted to be angry, to demand answers. But the truth was, I felt more confused than anything. Ethan's confession had shaken something deep inside me, something I wasn't ready to confront. But ignoring it wasn't an option anymore. By nightfall, the storm showed no signs of letting up. Ethan and I barely spoke during dinner, the silence between us heavy with everything we weren't saying. When it was finally time to turn in, I hesitated by the bed. Ethan was already lying down, his back turned to me. For a moment, I considered sleeping on the couch, but I knew it wouldn't solve anything. Avoiding him wouldn't make this go away. I climbed into bed, keeping as much distance as the mattress allowed. The rain drummed against the roof, a steady rhythm that seemed to match the pounding of my heart. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, every nerve in my body on edge. "Logan," Ethan said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. He didn't turn to face me. "I meant what I said earlier. But if you want me to leave after this trip, I will. I don't want to make things harder for you." His words surprised me. The vulnerability in his voice was unlike anything I'd ever heard from him before. "I don't want you to leave," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to do with any of this." He finally turned to face me, his expression soft but pained. "You don't have to do anything, Logan. I just needed you to know the truth." For a long moment, we just stared at each other, the only sound the rain and our unsteady breaths. And then, without thinking, I reached out. My hand brushed against his, tentative and unsure, but the touch was electric. Ethan's eyes searched mine, as if trying to gauge what I was thinking. "What are we doing?" I murmured, my voice shaking. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice low and raw. "But it feels like we've been dancing around this for a long time." His words sent a shiver through me. There was no denying the pull I felt toward him, the way my body seemed to betray every logical thought in my head. Slowly, hesitantly, he reached out and cupped my face in his hand. His touch was warm, grounding, and for a moment, I felt like the storm inside me quieted. "This is wrong," I whispered, even as I leaned into his touch. "Maybe," he replied, his voice soft. "But it doesn't feel that way." The distance between us disappeared, and before I knew it, his lips were on mine. The kiss was tentative at first, testing the waters, but it quickly deepened, fueled by everything we'd been holding back. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him as if he were the only solid thing in a world spinning out of control. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathless. Ethan rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed. "If this is too much, just say the word and I'll stop," he said, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer right away. My mind was a whirlwind, but my heart knew the truth. "I don't want you to stop," I admitted, my voice trembling but resolute. The storm outside raged on, but inside, it felt like something had shifted. For the first time, the tension between us wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace, something that had been waiting to happen all along. When I opened my eyes the next morning, the storm had finally passed. Sunlight filtered through the window, painting the cabin in golden hues. The air felt still, yet charged, as if the weight of the previous night lingered in every corner. My heart raced as the memories flooded back. The kiss, the electricity between us, the way Ethan had looked at me as if I were the only thing that mattered. I turned my head slowly and saw him lying next to me, his face relaxed in sleep. For a moment, I just watched him, my mind torn between guilt and something deeper, something I wasn't ready to name. The way his chest rose and fell, the faint trace of a smile on his lips. It was almost too much to bear. Slipping out of bed as quietly as I could, I padded over to the kitchen. My hands shook as I poured myself a cup of coffee, the bitter aroma doing little to calm my nerves. What had I done? What had we done? The questions swirled in my mind, each one heavier than the last. Couldn't sleep? Ethan's voice broke through the quiet, startling me. I turned to see him standing in the doorway, his hair tousled, his eyes still clouded with sleep. He looked so at ease, so unbothered, while I felt like I was unraveling. "I needed some air," I lied, avoiding his gaze. I took a sip of coffee, the liquid burning my tongue. Ethan crossed the room and leaned against the counter, his presence overwhelming in the small space. "Logan," he said softly, his tone careful. "About last night." "I don't want to talk about it," I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. I couldn't handle hearing whatever he was about to say. My emotions were already a tangled mess, and his words would only make it worse. Ethan frowned, but didn't push. Instead, he reached for his own cup of coffee, the silence between us stretching unbearably. I could feel his eyes on me, studying me, but I refused to look at him. The tension from last night was still there, but now it felt heavier, darker. I didn't know how to navigate this new reality we'd created. The day passed in a blur of avoidance. Ethan kept himself busy chopping more firewood and repairing the cabin's porch, while I wandered aimlessly through the surrounding forest. The fresh air helped, but only slightly. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, felt his touch, heard the way he'd said my name. It was maddening. By the time evening rolled around, I was exhausted. Ethan had made dinner, something simple, but the smell of it filled the cabin and reminded me just how long I'd been avoiding him. I sat at the table, my appetite non-existent, but Ethan placed a plate in front of me anyway. "You need to eat," he said firmly, sitting across from me. His tone left no room for argument. I picked at the food, my stomach twisting with nerves. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "We can't pretend nothing happened, Logan. You know that, right?" I looked up at him, my defenses crumbling. "I don't know how to deal with this, Ethan. I don't know what any of this means." "It means we stop running from it," he said simply. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and it terrified me. Whatever this is, whatever we are, we figure it out. Together. The honesty in his words took me off guard. For all the uncertainty I felt, there was something comforting about the way he said, "together." But the weight of it all still loomed large. The implications, the risks, it was too much to process. "Ethan, I need time," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." As the evening wore on, the tension between us softened, replaced by an uneasy truce. But as I lay in bed that night, with Ethan inches away, I knew that this was far from over. Whatever path we were on, it was only just beginning, and there was no turning back. The morning brought a fragile calm. Ethan greeted me with a soft smile, and we spent the day in quiet conversation, avoiding anything too heavy. The warmth of his presence felt natural now, but the unspoken questions still hung in the air. What did this mean for us? Could it survive outside this cabin? I didn't have answers, but for now, I let myself enjoy the simplicity of his company. By the next day, Ethan's phone buzzed, breaking the tranquility. His face darkened as he answered. The conversation brief but tense. "It's nothing," he assured me afterward, but his mood shifted. I pressed him later and he confessed it was someone from his past, a reminder of old wounds. "It's you I care about now," he said firmly, but the weight of his history pressed against the fragile bond we were building. Ethan's vulnerability deepened that evening as he told me more about his previous relationships and the challenges he'd faced. "I've made mistakes," he admitted, "but I want to do this right with you." His honesty moved me, but it also scared me. Could I handle the baggage he carried? Could we navigate these complexities together? For the first time, I began to see the depth of what we'd started. and the risks involved. On our final night in the cabin, Ethan reached for my hand as we sat by the fire. "I'm not perfect, Logan, but I'm here, and I'll keep showing up for you no matter what." His words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled in my chest. I didn't know what the future would bring, but in that moment, I believed him. Together, we could try. As we packed up the next morning, the cabin felt both heavier and lighter. It had been a place of transformation, but now we were heading back to the real world. Ethan's parting words stayed with me. "This doesn't end here. Not unless you want it to." Watching him drive away, I realized something had shifted. I wasn't the same person who had arrived, and I wasn't facing this alone. This story takes us on an emotional journey like no other, where Logan and Ethan confront their deepest feelings and challenge societal expectations in a secluded and intimate setting. It's not just a story of romance. It's one of self-discovery, courage, and the strength to face the unknown. From shocking revelations to moments of genuine connection, this plot captivates with its emotional depth and the challenges the characters overcome to accept who they truly are and what they mean to each other. And now, a special message for you, our viewer. Hey, did you enjoy today's story? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let us know in the comments what you thought about this emotional journey. On a scale from 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Remember, this is a real story, submitted by one of our followers. Tell us, what did you think of the ending? Would you have changed anything? What do you think should have been different for Logan or Ethan? Have you followed our channel yet? If not, make sure to hit that follow button and turn on notifications because we have hot and emotional gay stories like this every single day. You don't want to miss the next one? Thank you for watching and for being part of our community. See you in the next video.